Born in Greece, Khan was part of that incredible generation of immigrants who came to Australia with nothing but hope and determination. Like so many of his generation, he worked hard, raised a family, and became a pillar of Melbourne's tight-knit Greek community. At 87 years old, Khan was living in his modest home on Reynard Street in Coburg, a suburb that had become home to many Greek families over the decades. This wasn't just a house. It was the heart of the Crimeco family, where Sunday dinners brought everyone together and where Khan's door was always open to those he loved. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Khan's wife, his companion of decades, was seriously ill and had been hospitalized. This left Khan alone and vulnerable, something that would prove to be tragically significant. Khan was described by those who knew him as generous to a fault. He was the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. His family meant everything to him, and he'd do anything to help them out of a tough spot. This generosity, this unwavering love for his family, would ultimately be used against him in the most horrific way imaginable. The Greek community rallied around families like the Crimeco family. They looked out for each other, especially the elderly. But sometimes the biggest threats come from within. Now, let's talk about the family dynamics that set the stage for this tragedy. Khan had a son named George Crimeco. Like many adult children, George was trying to balance his own life while caring for aging parents. It's a struggle millions of families face, and it's never easy. George was in a de facto relationship with a woman named Danielle Lee Burchell. To Khan, Danielle wasn't just his son's partner, she was family. In Greek culture, when you welcome someone into your family, you don't do it halfway. Danielle would have been treated as a daughter-in-law with all the love and trust that comes with that relationship. But here's what makes this case so particularly devastating. Danielle was struggling with a serious heroin addiction. Now, addiction is a disease. And I'm not here to shame anyone for battling with substance abuse. But what happened next shows just how far addiction can drive someone to betray the people who love them most. Danielle knew Khan's routines. She knew when he'd be alone. She knew about his generous nature. And most importantly, she knew that with his wife in the hospital, he was at his most vulnerable. According to what would later come out in court, Danielle was desperate. She needed money, not just for her next fix, but she also wanted to buy a new car. In her mind, Khan represented an easy target, someone who loved her, trusted her, and would never see what was coming. The stage was set for a betrayal so profound that it would destroy not just one life, but an entire family's sense of security and trust. November 8th, because it's when everything went horribly wrong. It was a Wednesday afternoon in Melbourne. Danielle Burchell made the decision that would change everything. Something like that. Attack was so vicious, so prolonged. Blood splattered across Khan's living room floor. This wasn't a moment of panic or a struggle to get out of it. This was blood-stained, brutal assault. And here's the part that will make your blood run cold. She didn't try to save him. She simply left him dying on his own. Think about that for a minute. An 87-year-old the level of callousness is almost incomprehensible. Fast forward to 11 p.m. that same night. George Kritikos and Danielle Birchall arrived at Kahn's house. Now, according to the story they would tell police, they were just coming by for a visit. But remember, Danielle already knew exactly what they were going to find. As they approached the house, they could hear something that would haunt George for the rest of his life, his father's agonized moans coming from inside. When they entered, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. Kon Kritikos was lying on his living room floor, barely conscious, surrounded by blood. The man who had always been so strong, so resilient, was broken and dying. And standing right there beside George, watching his horror and grief, was the person responsible for it all. Can you imagine the acting job Danielle had to pull off in that moment? Pretending to be shocked, pretending to care, while knowing she was the one who had done this to a man who trusted her. George immediately called for help, and paramedics rushed Kon to the hospital. But the damage was already done. The injuries were too severe, the assault too brutal. Kon Kritikos would cling to life for 13 more days, but on November 24th, 2020, he succumbed to his injuries. During those final days, something happened that would prove crucial to the case. While Kon was drifting in and out of consciousness, struggling to communicate, he managed to identify his attacker to his son. According to George's testimony, Kon said her in Greek, pointing toward the woman who had been living as part of their family. Even in his final moments, Kon was trying to make sure justice would be served. When someone dies from injuries like Kon's, it immediately becomes a homicide investigation. Detective teams were assigned to the case, and they began piecing together what had happened in that house on Reynard Street. Initially, this looked like it could be a random home invasion. An elderly man living alone, attacked by strangers looking for money or valuables. These types of crimes, sadly, aren't uncommon. But as detectives dug deeper, the evidence started pointing in a very different direction. First, there were no signs of forced entry. Whoever had attacked Kon had been let into the house willingly. This suggested someone he knew and trusted. Second, nothing significant was actually stolen from the home. If this had been a robbery gone wrong, you'd expect to see valuable items missing. But that wasn't the case here. Third, and most importantly, the investigators began looking closely at the people in Kon's life. Who had access to his home? Who knew he would be alone? Who knew about his routines? All roads led back to the family. The investigation took months. Detectives had to be absolutely certain before making any arrests in a case like this. They interviewed family members, analyzed forensic evidence, and slowly built their case. Meanwhile, Danielle Birchall was going about her life, presumably thinking she had gotten away with murder. But the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. In March 2021, nearly 4 months after Kon's death, detectives made their move. Danielle Lee Birchall was arrested and charged with murder. The woman who had been welcomed into the Kritikos family as one of their own was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison. When this case finally went to trial, it became one of those courtroom dramas that captivated everyone following it. The prosecution, led by Daniel Porcedu, had to prove not just that Danielle had killed Kon, but that she had done so with murderous intent. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They argued that Danielle had planned this attack, that she had deliberately targeted Khan when she knew he was vulnerable and alone. The motive? Money. Pure and simple. She needed cash for heroin and wanted to buy a new car. And in her drug-addled mind, robbing and killing her partner's father seemed like a solution. The evidence they presented painted a picture of a brutal, premeditated attack. The forensic analysis of the blood spatter patterns, the severity of Khan's injuries, the weapon that was used. All of it pointed to a sustained and vicious assault. But perhaps the most damaging evidence was Khan's own words. Even dying, even barely conscious, he had identified his attacker. Her, he had said in Greek. It was like he was reaching out from beyond the grave to make sure his killer faced justice. The defense, meanwhile, the grave to make sure his killer faced justice. The defense, meanwhile, had an almost impossible job. How do you defend someone accused of such a heinous crime? Danielle's lawyers tried to argue that she hadn't intended to kill Khan, that perhaps the assault had gotten out of hand. They brought up her history of childhood abuse and her struggle with PTSD, trying to provide context for her actions. They also tried to suggest that maybe Danielle had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that perhaps someone else had attacked Khan, and she had simply been there when it happened. But the jury wasn't buying it. The evidence was too overwhelming, the case too clear-cut. Throughout the trial, the Greek community watched and waited. This wasn't just about one family. It was about their entire community's sense of safety and trust. If someone could do this to Crimeco, a beloved elder, and who was safe. In November 2024, after considering all the evidence, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty of murder, Justice Christopher Beale, who was presiding over the case, thanked the jury for their service and excused them from jury duty for the next 10 years. A clear indication of how traumatic this case had been for everyone involved. The sentencing hearing took place in April 2025. And it was every bit as emotional as you'd expect. Family members gave victim impact statements describing how Khan's murder had destroyed their lives and their ability to trust. Justice Christopher Beale had a difficult decision to make. On one hand, he was dealing with a crime of almost unimaginable brutality, the murder of a vulnerable elderly man by someone he trusted as family. On the other hand, he had to consider Danielle's background, her mental health issues, and her struggle with addiction. In the end, Justice Beale sentenced Danielle Burchell to 27 years in prison with a non-parole period of 20 years. In his sentencing remarks, he acknowledged that Danielle had suffered significant childhood abuse and had PTSD, which might complicate her time in custody. But he also made it clear that nothing could excuse what she had done to Crimeco. 27 years. Let that sink in for a moment. Danielle was essentially given a life sentence. She'll be in her 60s before she's even eligible for parole, assuming she ever gets it. The judge also noted that Danielle had already served nearly 4 years behind bars since her arrest, which would be counted toward her sentence. For the Crimeco's family, no sentence could ever bring back their beloved patriarch. No amount of time behind bars could undo the trauma of that horrible night when they found Khan dying on his living room floor. The impact of this crime extends far beyond just one family. The Greek community in Melbourne was shaken to its core. These are people who take pride in looking after their elders and keeping their families close and safe. The idea that someone could do this to one of their own, and that the perpetrator was someone they had welcomed as family, was almost too much to bear. George Crimeco lost not just his father, but his partner and the mother figure to any children in their relationship. His entire world was turned upside down in the span of a few hours. Imagine having to process not only the grief of losing your father in such a brutal way, but also discovering that the person you loved and trusted was responsible for it. The broader community started asking difficult questions. How do you protect vulnerable elderly people when the threat comes from within the family? How do you balance compassion for people struggling with addiction with the need to keep others safe? There are no easy answers to these questions. Addiction is a disease that can drive people to do unthinkable things, but that doesn't excuse the choices that led to Khan's death. For Danielle herself, she'll have decades in prison to think about what she did. Whether she feels genuine remorse for her actions or still maintains that she didn't intend for things to go as far as they did, only she knows. But the fact remains that an 87-year-old man is dead because of her choices. This case raises so many important issues that I think we need to talk about. First and foremost, elder abuse is a serious and often hidden problem in our society. While most cases don't end in murder, elderly people are frequently targeted by people they trust, family members, caregivers, or friends who take advantage of their vulnerability. But there's also something to be said for the fact that justice was ultimately served. Despite Danielle's attempts to cover up her crime, despite her claims that she was innocent, the truth came out. The jury saw through her lies, and she's now paying the price for what she did. Justice Christopher Beale's sentence of 27 years sends a clear message. Elder abuse will not be tolerated, and those who prey on the vulnerable will face the full force of the law. For the Crimeco's family and the broader Greek community, the healing process will take years, maybe decades. But hopefully, they can find some measure of peace in knowing that Khan's killer is behind bars and will remain there for a very long time. That's all for today's case, but before you go, I want to hear from you. What do you think about Danielle Burchell's sentence? Was 27 years enough for what she did to Khan Kritikos? How do we better protect elderly people from abuse and violence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button if this video kept you engaged, and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you never miss a case. I've got so many more shocking true crime stories coming your way, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the biggest monsters are the ones hiding in plain sight.